I know it's like not
Huh.
maybe the most exciting term, humility, but if you really look at it, it is the way of walking with God. It is a way of surrendering. It's a way of saying, Lord, I hold my calling with open hands to you because I don't want to be so focused on my calling that I miss out on relationship with you, the caller. I don't want to be so focused on my calling that I miss out on the community I'm meant to impact and the community that impacts me.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Up Next. And so today, well, I'd like to say I'm meeting a new friend, but I've already met a part of you, your husband Alan, who I just interviewed. And right as I was preparing for our interview, I saw that Alan had shared your post about your new book saying, "Congratulations to my wife." And boy, was I happily surprised that I
Yeah,
get now
that's
get a
so
chance to
fun.
sit there and talk with you.
Great, great
Yeah.
connection.
Well, where are you based at today, Ariana?
Yeah, so I am in Irvine, California, and we have a lot of wind happening outside. I don't know that it can be heard
Yes.
from here, but it's the weather's pretty crazy right now.
Yeah, and I hear there's potential fires that are going on in LA right now.
Yeah, and apparently it's I don't know, I'm not sure what the latest update is, but the Getty is very close there. And so just sort of praying for all of the artwork
Yeah,
there and the people in their houses. It's pretty wild. I'm not originally from California, so this kind of fire situation is a little bit
yeah.
different for me. I'm from Seattle, Washington. So
Ah, okay. So born and raised in Seattle, Washington for you?
well, technically, I was actually born in LA. My parents and I lived there for the first 7 years of my life, but we moved to Seattle, Washington. And I confess to you that my soul feels most alive when I'm in the Pacific Northwest with the trees and the
Yeah,
lake water and all the seasons, even the rain. I love it all. So.
yeah. When you were going through your college years, all of that, what did you think that you were going to do, and what are you currently doing right now at Biola?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'll be completely honest with you. I had no idea. I've loved Jesus since I can remember, and I realize that that is a huge privilege. I grew up in a home where my parents authentically helped me know who God was of my own
Yeah.
choice. So I really am blessed to have known him for as long as my memories had. But oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. I need to take away a cat toy. Hopefully we can
Oh
edit that
yeah.
out. It's going to make noise.
Please. Yeah.
We have a new baby kitten, and I just realized that she is gonna have a party while we're doing this. Okay, so I've loved Jesus since I was little, and I knew who I was as a daughter of God, which I realize is a privilege. But I had no idea how that translated into the world of work. I could never really figure it out. And I remember feeling a little embarrassed about it. I just didn't
Yeah.
quite know what I wanted to do. I mean, my first memory is I wanted to be a vet because I loved animals and I wanted to help animals. And then I'm like, oh, I don't want to help animals. Like, I don't know that I can handle them dying all the time. So probably not that. Then I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to fight for the cause of people.
Yeah.
But I realized that I didn't want to argue all the time. Then I wanted to be a psychologist because I wanted to listen to people's problems. But I realized that for my personality, being alone all day with just my patients probably wouldn't inspire me. I remember being in elementary school and wanting to be a pastor. And that was probably the longest sense of vocational interest I had until I went to college. But I did have an experience of working in a church for a while, and it wasn't the best.
Yeah.
And so I just didn't know. I graduated from college having no idea. If you were to ask me, I'd be like, I want to work in the nonprofit sector and maybe be
Yeah.
a motivational speaker. So I moved back home with my parents after I graduated college. Well, all of my friends were doing, backpacking trips to Europe. They had
Hmm.
an ideal
Hmm.
internship or they were getting engaged. And I moved back home with my parents. And that year after I graduated college, I worked part time at a church, part time at a nonprofit, and I cried every week because I just
Hmm.
didn't know where the Lord would have me. So I would go for walks every week and just ask the Lord, what does it mean to be an adult? How do I live for you, Jesus, in all that I do? Because I firmly believe that the work we do should be evidence of our faith. And I just didn't quite know exactly what my skill sets and passions were. I didn't have the best experience at the church, which is ironic because my parents worked at a church for a while. So I thought I knew, the ins and outs of,
Hmm.
how the
Hmm. Hmm.
sausage gets made. I had a phenomenal experience with the nonprofit, but I was a little bit bored after a while.
Yeah.
So after a lot of prayer, I went back to school. I got my master's degree. And when I did that, I felt like a bird that was let out of a cage with my wings spread out. And I realized that I love the intellectual application of communication. So my background is communication. I study organizational communication. And in grad school, I realized that the principles that we were learning in class could actually help make things better. And so after my master's, I worked part time for another nonprofit, which I just loved doing. I also was an adjunct professor, and I began doing some consulting for communication, helping. My first group was actually
Yeah,
missionaries, helping them
yeah,
develop their public speaking skills. At the time, Tommy, I had no idea what I was doing still. And if you were to ask me, I would have had a great answer,
yeah.
but in my heart, I didn't know. And so after about a year, I realized I was a little bored, and I was single, which is sometimes strange in the Christian world to be single at that time. So I thought if I can get a full ride scholarship, I should go back and get a PhD. I don't know what I will use it for, but I'll do it. And so I applied. I got into my top choice. I got a full ride scholarship. I got my PhD, and it wasn't until the third year of my PhD when I was walking on campus. I was teaching classes and taking classes, and I felt this tap in my spirit and this like opening of love for college students that just sort of overflowed on me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I think I want to be a professor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ariana, I love that journey because a lot of times there are some people who sit there and they know they want to be a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. For you, a lot of times you spend time looking, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do that? What did those years of roaming, exploring, all of that, how did that shape you as a person that you are today?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, I mean, it's great if you know what you want to do. That is so
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, yeah,
But I also would not change anything about my path because,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I worked at Nordstrom for a while in sales. I worked at a radio station. In my experience with the church and the nonprofit world, consulting, helping other people develop their public speaking skills, all of those things taught me a little bit about myself, about God, and enhanced my skill set. So I will say that since I can remember, I've been very passionate about mentorship. And when I think of being a
mm-hmm.
professor, in my mind, it's an opportunity to mentor and to help people feel empowered to do what they can do. So I think for me, the journey, if I'm being completely honest, was
Hmm.
so overwhelming. And I felt often like I was the only one who didn't know. And I felt a lot of shame about that. Now, as a
Yeah,
professor, and I
yeah,
hear
yeah,
students coming into my office all the time who have no idea what they're doing, I realize that that's somewhat common. And one of the things that I try to encourage them, especially in their first several years out of college, is what kind of first job foundations can you pursue to sharpen the skills and acquire new skills in your tool belt so
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
as you
yeah,
pursue your calling, you are ready to take action when the doors open?
yeah. No, I love it. Uh, as you're talking, you remind me, I remember graduating from Washington University in St. Louis, and I had a business major and business management, and I built cell towers for 10 years. And I kept wondering, Lord, is this what you want me to do? I didn't know. I was decent at my job, but I just didn't know. So I said, okay, I'm going to go into seminary. Went to Moody Seminary. I'm going to be a pastor. Ariana, just like you, it didn't fit. I just didn't like my experience. I was kind of bored. There's nothing wrong being a pastor. For me, I was
Yeah.
just bored. Then, okay, maybe I'll work at a ministry organization. Moody Bible Institute hired me in their president's office. For 3 years, I worked there. It wasn't a good fit. I didn't like
Yeah.
it. And I spent time roaming around from place to place trying to figure out what is it that you want me to do. It's a journey, isn't it?
It's such a journey. And if I could go back in time and just tell myself, because calling is about relationship with the caller, which means it's always going to be in process, which means there's always opportunity to learn. No thing is actually a failure. There is no
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
that actually has to feel like failing. And anytime you realize that's not for me, that's great because you can check it off the list. And also sometimes that's not for me in that season. And so it's not that maybe an opportunity won't come back again at a different time in our lives.
Yeah. And in some sense, actually, you have to prevent the temptation of just comparing yourself to others because you're going to
Yeah.
look at others and say, wow, why do they have their life together? They seem so successful. They're in the tech business, they're in data analysts. Am I doing something wrong? Each person is a little bit different. And so you have to be patient with the journey that God gives you, the doors that He opens and closes along the way.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
we never know what's going on in someone else's life anyway. So it might look like they have it all together, but chances are they're still figuring something out in some part of their life. And so
Yeah.
I think we're all in process, and it's a journey, and it's really easy to get seduced by the allure of control and certainty. But the reality is the only thing that's certain in this world is God. And
Yeah.
there's actually a lot of beauty to not knowing exactly what we're doing and trusting the Lord to lead us forward. I do think there is an element of diligence, though. It sounds like you did this too, Tommy, where even in those moments that weren't working, you paid attention to it and you
Yeah.
had the courage to say, this isn't working. I think sometimes people get stuck in a job that they don't love, but the security of that job, either the title, the paycheck, or just like knowing how to do it, keeps them stuck in a place when deep in their heart, they have a thirst for more. And I think it takes a lot of courage to trust that thirst and try something different.
Yeah. And this is actually a good topic that leads us to your book, Healthy Calling From Toxic Burnout to Sustainable Work. How did you go about what made you decide to write this book?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that. I think, again, this is a whole journey. But to consolidate it, when I was working after my master's program at a nonprofit and I was studying, it was run by these two amazing women who
Hmm.
shared space and really knew how to mentor. In fact, my first my first week on the job there, the president gave me a box of books, a box, and said, I want you to understand what motivates me about this company and where my heart is.
Oh,
So your job is to read all of these books. I'll see you in 2 weeks. And so my first job at this place was to educate myself on the ethos of the company. And I thought that was amazing. So I've
mm,
noticed how organizations like that were actually functioning well with a lot of health. I also thought back to some other experiences of organizations that weren't doing that. And, all of them being within the Christian circle. And I thought to myself, how do we balance our Christian values and our
yeah,
professional contexts? So I did some research on that. And in that research, I kept hearing the word calling. Now,
yeah.
as Christians, we use that term all the time. But when I got to my PhD, which was a very secular program, I noticed that the word meaningful work, the subset of that, one of the ways in which we experience meaningful work is a calling. And so I began studying that. 10 years later, after interviewing a bunch of people, how they perceive work as a calling, the thing that I kept noticing, and by the way, I should say, if you feel like your job is a calling more than any other peer group in the workplace, you are the most motivated, the most satisfied. You have greater resilience and the ability to stick it out when there's organizational change or economic shifts. You work harder than
Mm,
most. You tend to bring a lot of contribution and positivity into the scene. So you're the person people want. But as you might guess, that also means that more than any other people group, if you feel called to your job, you are the most prone to burnout. And when I
yeah,
was
yeah,
doing my
yeah, yeah.
research, I was noticing how certain people who felt called thrived and avoided burnout or recovered from it, and certain people did not. And I just thought
Huh.
to myself, I want to help us not get trapped by burnout, because burnout from a calling has its very unique fingerprint. It's very different than other types of burnout.
Wow, interesting. Now, at the same time, like for instance, I'm sitting here thinking about myself and Resource Global. It has been a 10-year journey, which started out with a problem with global missions, leaders, funding, everything like that. And now it's getting a chance to work with all these young Christian marketplace leaders from around the world. And so people ask me, Tommy, do you ever get burned out? I said, no, I get tired. I get frustrated. Sometimes I want to leave this job, but it's
Yeah.
my calling. How do you get to that point? How does a person get to that point, Ariana?
Of burnout? How do
Of
they get?
calling. How do you get to a point?
Oh, of
Yeah.
calling. Gosh, well, that's a great question. I mean, again, if we go back to calling in the workplace, it's known by four things. So if you feel so, again, as we're talking about calling, I'm not talking about our primary calling, which as
Hmm.
Christians is
Hmm.
to love God and love
Yeah.
others. If you are a believer, we all have a calling to love God and love
Yes.
others. That is the greatest commandment. That's what we get to do. But that only acknowledges that God is a masterful, sovereign king. We also need to recognize that he is an intimate creator, and he knows us, and he's designed each of us with specific skill sets and passions. Some of those we can easily apply to work. Others are harder to do. Maybe we feel that sense of calling, which is a secondary calling, in relationship or in service or in other parts that aren't paid work. But if you experience work as a calling, it's typically four things are happening. One is
Hmm.
you see it as meaningful. There's purpose
Yeah.
behind it. I mean, I've interviewed someone who was a makeup artist at an organization, and she felt she was able to help people feel beautiful who never felt
Yeah.
beautiful, and she felt
Yeah.
called to
Yeah.
do that. I've interviewed an NFL coach, a stay-at-home parent, a lawyer, a financial advisor, an artist, a musician, all those things, and they all identify it as being meaningful. The second thing is that you can identify a type of caller. Now, even non-Christians talk about calling all the time.
All the
And I
time.
think
Yeah.
that's pretty cool because we were hardwired to thirst for that. And so even if you're not identifying as a Christian, there's something thirsty in you for that. And so as Christians, we identify that as God the caller. So meaningful work, calling. The third thing is that there's a specific skill set and passion that we can apply to it.
Hmm.
So it's not enough to just be good at something. It feels really good to be good at something, but that's not sustainable over the long term. It's not enough to simply be good at it. You have to like it. You have to be passionate about it. And it's not enough to just be passionate about it, because passion alone, as one CEO I interviewed said, passion alone makes you a great fan. Passion and skill set make you a great employee. So meaningful, caller, skill set and passion. And then the fourth one, this is huge: positive contribution to society. When we
Yeah.
think about calling, there's a pro-social nature to it that makes it different than a hobby. And I think a lot of times, especially in Western society, where we magnify an individualistic tendency, we miss out on the third C of calling. The third C of calling is community. So we've got the called, that's us. We've got the caller, that's God. But the third C, the collective part of calling, is community.
Yeah. 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 And as I hear you talk, and for those who are listening, it may take some time to realize that calling, right, Ariana? Like, for
Oh my
instance,
gosh. Yes.
David, who was tending the sheep, early on in his career, he could have said, my calling is to take care of the sheep and to grow this as a shepherd boy and grow this empire. Well, later on, when he fought Goliath, okay, my calling is to be a warrior. Who knew that God was preparing him to be one, if not the greatest king of Israel? It may take time for that calling to be realized.
Absolutely. And in fact, those other parts could be seasonal callings or equipping
Correct,
callings.
correct,
So
correct, correct.
they are
Yeah.
not pointless. And that's what I think is so exciting, is that in the context that we're in, even if it feels mundane, there are things that we can learn. There's a reason we call Jesus rabbi and teacher. And it's because part of having a healthy calling is having a lifestyle of learning, seeing every
Yeah.
opportunity as an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, I was just studying the book of Acts in Lydia. And so you have Lydia,
Yeah.
who is a successful CEO from modern day Turkey, goes into Philippi. And well, I'm there just to do business. I need to find a place of worship. I encountered these guys by the name of Paul and Silas and all that stuff. Well, she ends up being the leader and the founder of the first church in Europe. Who would have thought that she would be leading the first church in Europe here?
That's right. I love it. In fact, I write a little bit about her in the calling book as an example of someone who experiences that process of calling. That's great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then, but at the same time, how does that calling then go in a negative route in terms of burnout?
Yeah, that's such a good and important question. And I think that the problem is that burnout is deceptive. So burnout begins, the genesis of burnout is chronic stress. So it's different than regular stress. So regular stress is like you're launching a new thing, you have a new relationship, you've moved, there's some sort of new thing in your life that has an initial hard push, a hard season, but you know that at some point it will end. That's good stress, normal stress. Chronic stress is when we normalize fatigue, cynicism, busyness, chaos, lack of patience, a bloated calendar where we do not have margin space. And in that chronic stress, several things happen. especially to our communication, by the way. We have a lot of things that happen to our nonverbal communication and how we talk about others and how we talk with ourselves. But ultimately, burnout can happen. Now, there's a lot of things that impact burnout that are beyond our control, like organizational manipulation, exploitation, life stuff that impacts things. I know in my own life, I had some family health issues in the last several years that really impacted just an overall sense of exhaustion and
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
regular burnout. But burnout from a calling, there are two dark sides that really gear us towards that make us very prone to that. The first one is workaholism. Workaholism is an addiction. And workaholism is something that we tend to honor or even compliment people with. I would love it if people stopped using that as a compliment. You can have a high
Mm.
capacity. You can say, wow, I have a high capacity for this. But an addiction is when it's no longer about doing something you love for the good feeling. It's about doing something you love to avoid, or that you loved to avoid the bad feeling. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
in many ways, if work as a calling kind of replaces our relationship with the caller, if we
Yeah.
confuse the calling with the caller, we become addicted. That's
Yeah.
one option. Another option is work as an idol, job idolization. And in this, work is the primary orienting goal of our lives. We use work as an excuse to not show up for our family and friends. We use work as an excuse to not care for ourselves, to not Sabbath and rest. We use work as an excuse to bypass slowing down and having empathy and compassion for other people because we got to get it done because this is important work. This is God's work. When in reality, love is patient, love is kind,
Mm.
love holds no record of wrong. The fruit of the Spirit, that's not a gendered fruit. That's not a certain type of person fruit. That is fruit that we should be emitting if we are believers. And so, workaholism and job idolization, they don't happen overnight. They can happen in increments, but all of a sudden, our calling is no longer a way of expressing who we are. It defines who we are. And that is a dangerous place to be.
When a person feels like they're in that, how do they make steps to get out of it?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing is it's not going to go away on its own.
Yeah.
So you have to address it proactively. There's a lot of things that go into what makes a healthy calling, but I think ultimately at the core is actually humility. If we pursue the virtue of humility, humility is the mother of all virtues, which, by the way, the opposite is pride, right? It's the vice
Yeah.
of all of those things. Humility, in Micah 6:8, we're told that we need to walk humbly with our God. We're told to be humble because Jesus was humble. And in humility, by focusing on that, we actually surrender some of those vices immediately. Because to be humble means knowing who we are, knowing our strengths and our weaknesses, and not being distracted by either of those things. Jesus was humble. Do we think he knew who he was? He knew
Mm.
who he was. He was the Son of God.
Mhm.
He also knew the limitations of being born into flesh. And so recognizing those components. The second thing is that he was a learner, always going to the Father to learn more. At 12, he was in the temple talking with other rabbis, learning and educating. So I think knowing your strengths and weaknesses, not being distracted by either one, being a lifetime learner. And then I think the third part of humility, that if we pursue it, it leads us away from burnout. And the third part is knowing how to take a break. We are not the
Mm.
God of the universe. The Holy Spirit is still at work when we slow down. And if we don't know how to Sabbath, which is the first thing God called holy in the Bible, then we will ultimately confuse the caller with ourselves. And that is not
Yeah.
a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Well, I love talking with you about this because one of the questions that initially I was going to ask you is, talk to me about this research between humility and burnout, but you tied it all in. This
Yeah.
whole idea of burnout and calling, it does tie in with this concept of humility.
Yeah. I know it's like not
Huh.
maybe the most exciting term, humility, but if you
Yeah.
really look at it, it is the way of walking with God. It is a way of surrendering. It's a way of saying, Lord, I hold my calling with open hands to you because I don't want to be so focused on my calling that I miss out on relationship with you, the caller. I don't want to be so focused on my calling that I miss out on the community I'm meant to impact and the community that impacts me. I don't want to be so focused on my calling that I start closing my hands around it and I'm unwilling for you to change it and move it and grow it. So
Yeah.
that is where humility is really the compass.
Okay, so Ariana, tangibly, for someone like you, what does
Yeah.
that look like for you on a day-to-day basis then?
Oh, good question. So many things. So first of all, we do Sabbath as a family. I started Sabbathing in grad school. My parents worked for themselves. They taught me so much about so many things about God, but I did not learn to rest from them. It wasn't until grad school that I learned that whole process. So we Sabbath together. Now, Sabbathing looks very different as a single person, as
Yeah.
married without kids, as married with a very young kid, as married with grown kids or retired. So there's a whole way to approach it, because ultimately Sabbath is tithing our time to the author of time, surrendering in a day as a symbolic act of saying, Lord, you're in charge of everything. I think John Mark Comer said it best when he talked about it's surrendering the wants, the worries, and the work for that one day. So we Sabbath, and I can talk more about that if you want me to. But we
Yeah.
Sabbath. For me, something that's actually been really helpful as in the workplace is the day before my Sabbath, I have a kind of pre-game Sabbath strategy. I know I have to work extra hard the day before and the day after. And so because of that, we Sabbath on Saturdays. On Friday mornings, I wake up really early and I go for a 30-minute walk. I'm very blessed to live by the beach. So I walk by the beach and I just take time to ask the Lord to remind me of my week, what I've done, what I've said, what I'm thinking about. And I surrender this final hard push workday to Him before taking a break. Now, we have a young kid at home. So Sabbath for us isn't necessarily restful
Yeah.
physically, but it is for me, a surrendering. Oh, I'm not going to worry about that today. Today, I give that to you, Lord. And actually, it makes me realize how much I worry and strategize and plan all the time, because on my Sabbath day, I'm like, Lord, I'm not going to meditate on those things. I am surrendering them to you. Another type of humility concept for me is giving myself more margin time in responding to people, especially at work. I'm very sensitive to like, we need to answer this and I need this answer now. And instead saying, thank you so much. Let me get back to you. Even if it's 5 minutes, giving myself time to slow down and pay attention to what's going on, looking at my calendar, looking for those margin moments is really, really essential. I tend to gravitate on the side of like being aware of my strengths or aware of my weaknesses. I tend to
Hmm.
gravitate more towards what I'm not doing well. So part of that humility compass is, am I focusing too much on that? Because guess what that is? That's simply another version of pride. That is still focused on the self, even if it's not on my strengths. If I'm focusing on my weaknesses, that's still a focus on the self. And I think the thing that dissolves that the most is gratitude. So I still think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Part of humility for me is listening to podcasts like yours, reading books, having mentors, people who challenge me to extend my thinking all the time.
Very, very good. Ariana, it also ties in with what your husband, Alan, is doing as well too.
Yes.
You feel like this whole idea of healthy calling, all of that, is that thinking different for young marketplace leaders, which your husband is studying, versus older marketplace leaders? Have you seen the difference between that?
So actually, it's interesting that you touch on that. That's the area of research I'd like to go next, is studying
Yeah.
the differences. I think that it will look different, but the core values are the same. So it must be very humbling, I would imagine, for older marketplace leaders to realize they have something to learn from the younger ones.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
must be very humbling to be in the field for so long and realize, things are still changing. Now, I think the hardest challenge probably for those who are new is maybe that third part of knowing when to take a rest. Because when you're new and you're having to prove yourself and work overtime and say yes to more, it's
Yeah.
really hard to know how to create those boundaries. And this is where we have to be careful of boundary shaming versus boundary resilience, because boundary shaming is when someone is implying we need to do more or explicitly saying we need to do more than what we've signed up for. And if we say no, there's a social consequence to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
we have to be careful of those things. So I think it does manifest itself differently, but the core principles are the same.
Yeah. And the reason why I ask all these different questions, Ariana, you know this now because you're now married to an Asian family.
Yeah.
Asians are always working all the time. But as
Hmm.
a 47-year-old, I worked under baby boomers. I
Yeah.
watched as my parents never took a break. They were
Mhm.
always working Monday through Sunday. I worked for a boss who used to come to my office and says, Tommy, if you're tired, you keep pushing.
Yeah.
You don't rest until you get to heaven. That's when you rest. And that was the environment which I grew up in, which is very, very different than how I'm understanding things right now as I continue to get older.
Sure. I think we have to be careful always to not let generational backgrounds define what is biblical,
Yeah,
rather
yeah,
going back to the Bible itself. And there are different seasons. If you go back and you trace history, work as meaningful, work sometimes was seen as a privilege, as emulating what God did by creating. That's in the Renaissance. But prior to that, in the Roman era, with Aristotle and Plato, work was something that only poor people did, and the thinkers were the people in charge, right? And so how people understand working versus, blue collar, white collar, thinking versus doing jobs, generational components, cultural components, all those have an influence to it. But I think this is where we do have to be careful. We have to work hard. We're meant to
yeah,
work hard.
yeah,
There are
yeah,
verses
yeah,
in the
yeah,
Bible that say, I am training for a race. And my husband is a marathon runner. I would not call myself a marathon runner. I run half marathons. But
yeah,
you know that when you're training, you have to be diligent. You have to be disciplined. You have to say no to things that other people can say yes to so you can run your race well. But even the best athlete knows if you don't take a break, your body will break. And
yeah,
so knowing how to take a rest, again, that's the first thing God called holy in the Bible. He did that himself. If we are to be like God, rest is part of the equation. So when someone says, you rest when you're in heaven, I would literally have to take a pause and say, I really appreciate that sentiment, but rest is a holy endeavor. And as I follow Jesus, that's a value for me too.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And Ariana, I started noticing, even for me, something was wrong because I believe in hard work. I believe you got to get the job done. You got to give it the best. I started realizing something was wrong when I wasn't working. I would feel guilty, and I kept sitting
Yeah,
there. Why am I feeling guilty if I'm not working? And
sure.
so I had to start asking myself, what is driving me? Why do I feel this way? Is this healthy? Is this unhealthy? And so that is my Asian upbringing, is how I was trained and got me to this point. Where so those are some of the hard questions I had to ask myself.
So I would say no. I mean, not necessarily. So my experience with my husband, who comes from an Asian family, he's an Enneagram 3. If you're familiar with that, he is an
Yeah,
achiever. He is a tech. If you were to look in the Enneagram book of some sort, his picture could be there. But I think that the bright side of that is for him to rest means to play and create in different things. For
yeah,
me to
yeah,
rest is to slow down and be contemplative, go for a walk, journal, sit with a cozy
yeah,
blanket and some tea. And so actually when we were married early on, we were actually visiting his family in Taiwan, and we had some high tea at this tall tower, and we were talking about how our Sabbathing wasn't working well together. And we realized it's because rest to me equals slowing down, and rest to him equals playing and being active in a different way. So this led us on to a whole journey of exploring, what does it really mean to restore, to
mhm,
unplug from the
yeah, yeah,
tyranny
yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah,
urgent. And there's actually 7 types of rest. So I think sometimes we confuse rest as looking like only one thing. There's 7
yes,
types
yeah,
of
yeah,
rest. I also think that we confuse Sabbath with solitude. Those go hand in hand often, but they are not the same thing. Sabbath is actually a very communal experience. So I would say that typical Asian affinity to work can still be a good thing if you frame it the right way in a time of rest. But my husband would tell you also, he's grateful to be married to someone who says, "Hey, let's slow down and just, look at the sunset together, or notice the flowers as we're walking," and that's also important too. So I think the slowing down part is important, but
yeah.
what you choose to do to restore is still part of the makeup of who you are.
Yeah, yeah. You make a great point, Ariana, because for me, a lot of times there's nothing worse than sitting on the beach and staring at the ocean because it would drive me crazy.
Yeah.
But the one thing I love is I love stats and I love fantasy football and basketball.
I
So if I
love
could
it.
sit there with a bunch of stats and play around with my players and stats, I'm so happy. It just relaxes me and allows me to really be able to feel like I don't have to worry about work all the time.
Sure. Well, I think the biggest issue for Sabbath versus a day off, because those are two different things, is
Yeah.
that Sabbath means doing things that turn your heart and mind to the Lord. So,
Yeah.
whatever those things are that turn your heart and mind to the Lord, that unplug from the normal things that vie for your time, that's key. But even in a day off of rest, which is, again, is a little bit different, we tend to think of like, oh, Sabbath's going to be my day off, and then I'm going to work 6 days a
Yeah.
week. And Sabbath is not the kitchen sink. It is not where we throw all of our dirty dishes in and expect to get those clean. Ideally, we do have another kind of day off in addition to Sabbath because it is a holy endeavor to remind ourselves who is in charge and where we fit in the equation of calling.
Yeah. 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 We have so much to talk about. We're running out of
Yeah.
time here. Ariana, where can people find more about you? I know you're teaching at Biola, social media, website. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, great. Yes, I'm a professor at Biola University. I also work as a consultant on the side for churches, nonprofits, and organizations in terms of healthy communication practices. You can find me at my website, ariannamolloy.com. You can also get my book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any other general book links. And it would be my pleasure to answer any other questions that anyone has. As you can see, I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Her book, Healthy Calling From Toxic Burnout to Sustainable Work. Ariana, before I let you go, and we're going to have you come more, whether it's in Jakarta, Nairobi, we're going to have you speak
I
to
love it.
everyone in the future. Two fun questions. Number one, is rest going to Disneyland, is that considered rest for you?
Not for me, but for my husband, it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Two, since you're now married to your husband is Asian, what is one Asian food that you've come to enjoy since being married?
Oh my gosh. I love all food. That's one of the things that we bonded over when we were training to run. Just as friends, we were running and he was teaching me how
Yeah,
to do longer runs. I love all of it. I have not eaten the stinky fruit. I'm blanking on the
durian.
name of that. Yes. But I mean, rice is a total staple for us in every way and I love trying new food because I think it's a bit of an adventure every time. So I'm not sure I could choose. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
bao is wonderful.
yeah. And there is a difference between regular, like there's Chinese, there's Taiwanese food. There's a unique difference. Uh,
Yes.
Shanghainese food or Mandarin or different things like that.
We've been to Hong Kong and Taiwan. I'm really looking forward to exploring other Asian territories as well. And we're going to New Zealand soon, so that'll be fun. But yeah, I mean, I love food of all kinds. I'll try almost anything at least once.
Very good. One last thing, it is always funny because I'll walk into a Chinese restaurant with my Caucasian friends, and I would tell them there's usually two menus. They'll hand you an American menu, but there's also another Chinese, and it just blows their mind. They just go, they say, "Why do you have two different menus?" It's just two different types of dishes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for making time.
My pleasure. I'm so
Yeah.
delighted. Hope to see you again.
We'll talk soon. Bye.